First of all, I want to thank each and every one of you. I made a joke earlier with somebody saying if we were in the situation of the quarantine and the pandemic, I would never be able to put this group of people together. Well, the point of this, so we're having this series of conversation with multiple people regarding to architecture design, interior design, and product design as well. And we've been hearing a lot from creators, but I feel like it's important to hear from the people who are telling the stories, who are the editors, the journalists, the critics. And that's one of the main reasons I want to get everyone to give a perspective, in your opinion, about where we're at today in terms of the industry overall. I think one thing I'm interested to hear from you guys in terms of the, how do you feel about the influence and the responsibility when you're writing a story? That how can that impact not only the subject of the story, but an industry in general?
With architecture, there's a lot of authority to being a critic, but there's not necessarily very much outright power. I think it's a good explanation of the difference between power and authority. Years ago, I don't think this is true anymore, but in the heyday of the New York Times' power, the theater critic of the New York Times, people would say, if he didn't like a play, it would close. That would be the end of it. Nobody tears down a building if the architecture critic doesn't like it. It's still there. You can have some gradual impact on people's taste and judgment over time. And sometimes criticism can affect things that haven't been built yet. And I'm a great believer in writing about things when they're in the planning stage to impact on them and affect them. And I think sometimes the most important positive impact of criticism is not in what has been built, but what has not been built, and either making it better or preventing things that are horrible from happening. But at the end of the day, criticism can have gradual impacts on people's taste and judgment and make for a more literate public, more visually literate and design sensitive and savvy public. But it doesn't necessarily change everything quickly and automatically either. And maybe that's healthy. I wouldn't want to be some autocrat decreeing what happens in the world of architecture and, like an emperor saying off with its head, no, no, no. Mm-hmm. I prefer having authority rather than raw power, I think.
What about you, Asad?
As an editor, I think, that difference between authority and power, which I think Paul is so astute to point out, is something that you really get a grasp of when you're talking about the built environment at any scale. So building level, obviously, but then also thinking about, when I was an editor at Curbed, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about the street, thinking about cities and neighborhoods. And I have found real inspiration in the idea that through our work as editors, other people realize their authority and to some extent their power in influencing what their built environments, what their neighborhoods, what their cities look like. And I think in this moment, perhaps now more than ever, people are awake to that power and the influence that they can have at every scale in the cities where they live. And that seems like an exciting opportunity, both for the people, any people in a city, but then also for us as editors and journalists.
Now, Fiona, you also have a big platform that you work with. So for you, do you have that sense of responsibility that your work not only going to be seen regional, but also in such a large platform all over the world?
Yeah, so for those of you who maybe don't know, so I'm the global editor of CNN Style. So we have a very large digital global audience at CNN, obviously. I think for us, because our role is not necessarily to critique or pass judgment on the work that we're covering, it's more about contextualizing it and helping to translate sometimes quite niche stories to a kind of more broad stream audience. The way that I like to think about it is we sort of try and put culture in context, whether that's a design story or a fashion story or an art story. And of course, over the last 6 months, there's been a lot of context to make sense of. So I think for us, we've certainly felt a responsibility for sure. And I think just a greater sense of mission to tell these stories and to help people make sense of the world around them through the lens of design and architecture, but also fashion, culture, more broadly. So yeah, I think the team and I are feeling incredibly spurred on at the moment to keep telling these stories.
I so agree with what Fiona said. It's also about shining a light on something that sort of people aren't seeing. I feel like we get design and architecture stories from, like, you know, the known design capitals of the world. So it's so fun when I get to kind of like work with our Africa team or our India team and sort of like just do a local story. So it's kind of also about shining a light. So I don't know if everyone knows, but I write for Quartz, which is a global business news site that was started by The Atlantic. And I'm the only design writer on staff. And when I began, I also had this chip on my shoulder, or sort of this mission to sort of correct what my editors thought design was, or a design story was. So in the beginning, the stories were lighter, and I think I so wanted to contextualize them in politics or whatever the kind of the most pressing news of the day is, and sort of to pair a design story that way. In the beginning, it was like, here's this cool chair, or here's this. So there's that too.
And I think the interesting thing about, I think Fiona mentioned, is about putting the context of what everything was going on, but also introduce a little bit of a culture. But how important is for that story to resonate with your readers? Because at the end of the day, you want your work to be seen. That's the purpose of what you're doing. And the broader audience and the more eyeballs or clicks or whatever it is the result of a successful, quote unquote, publication and article. So for you, how do you craft a story to resonate with the local community, but also with a global viewer? Who wants to take a crack at that first?
Well, actually, I wanted to pick up. I'm going to answer your question by picking up on something Anne said, because I think it's very important to try to connect design to larger issues. Design is, it's not just about shining a light on a pretty object and saying how pretty it is. Even if it is indeed true, and we may all feel that ourselves and love it, we want design journalism to not stop there. By the way, I still think shining a light on something admirable is an important part of design journalism and should always be. It just doesn't stop with that. If it does, it's failed. But we shouldn't abandon that as a part of the mission. But I think a much more urgent part of the mission is to connect to larger things going on. I mean, I've been fascinated by all the discussion in the last several months about the transformation of the street and public space, mm-hmm. and how the pandemic affects that. The opening up of streets. Is that going to permanently change the way we perceive urban streets? The painting of the Black Lives Matter lettering on the street in Washington and now repeated in New York, mm-hmm. It's a political statement. It's also an act of design. It's a design object. And what is the meaning of it as a design object? I mean, these places where you see the urgent issues of this moment intersect with design are the way in which I think design journalism proves that it's not just about things that are quote lifestyle unquote, but really connects to urgent things about our lives.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Paul. I think it's about when you're speaking to, if you have the luxury of writing for a, beautiful niche title where everyone who's there is there for a reason and they want to read design content and they're there for it and they kind of have the context already, then I think your job is slightly different. But if you're trying to speak to an audience of people who maybe say, oh, I don't really care about design, it's just expensive tables and fancy lamps and it's just
right.
not something that I'm into.
Right.
Starting from the back foot, and you really have to, it's our responsibility and our job to find a way to engage with that person too, and welcome them into this world in a way that isn't patronizing, that isn't dumbing down, but shows them how they actually do care about design. They just maybe didn't even know that they care, and that's about what Paul was saying around just that intersection between the issues that matter, urgent topics of the day that are much more, I guess, mainstream, and then finding that point where they become a design, urban planning, a architecture story.
Exactly.
I think so often too, local stories, their hyper specificity is what makes them universally appreciable by people with different priorities, different backgrounds, different interests. The stories that you're pointing to, Paul, about Black Lives Matter being painted on the street in front of the White House in DC. I mean, that began as a quite local story. It was Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, making this design decision in her city. And then the ripple effect of that across the US, and not just across the US, but over social media. So people globally were kind of seeing this story play out. That was a really local story. And I think so often those kinds of stories can be dismissed, whether they're designers working on the continent of Africa or working in India or working in a small town in Ohio, because they feel too small to be given like splashy coverage. But I think those small stories so often have a lot of influence, or can have a lot of influence, in how people think about their own cities, their own neighborhoods, their own spaces. And so that, I think, has been something that we've all been learning anew in this era when we're so connected by this pandemic and connected by this social movement in the US and globally. So that has been really exciting to see, I think.
Yeah.
If I might add, just on that same story in the Black Lives Matter painting or signage, street signage, I think there's also a role for journalists to interrogate a nice sounding story. So as you know, there was some more sort of context behind that, the politics. They were saying, oh, that's just for show. Sometimes it's tempting just to sort of headline the kind of incredible work, but there's actually sometimes juicier sort of context behind it. And I think it's our role as responsible design journalists to say, always talk about context, always have a balanced story.
Yeah. Right, because of course we all love design and we know what its power can be, and also we know what its limits are. There are limits. There are political limits. When you paint Black Lives Matter on the street, that's a great gesture, and your point is so great that I saw a lot of great writing about whether or not that was a hollow gesture, what it actually meant in the end, who it helped, who it didn't help. And that is really important too. And I think all of us have likely run into instances where we've needed to say, our industry, these industries that we're covering, have limits too, and require the contextualization, because you've got to have both. You've got to have the design intervention and the policy or the civic conversation around whatever it is that's happening.
I couldn't agree more with you, Asad. The design journalism I like least is the design journalism that writes from the standpoint that good design will save the world, and that's the end of the discussion. Because we should know it's not so simple. We do know it's not so simple, but so we should write, acknowledging that it's not so simple.
I think that extends to the conversation that we've seen in the design world, particularly so over the last few years, around sustainability.
Yeah.
No.
You see a sort of greenwashing.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a sustainable product, and it's like you're making more stuff.
Right.
So let's talk about that too. And a lot of people, every press release I get these days is sustainable.
Right there.
Yeah, and you're going, okay, but what does that actually mean? Do you know exactly where this thing came from, and how it was made, and do the credentials, are they really there, or are we just saying they're there because it's a great marketing tool at the moment? So it's another trap that I think we'll have to be very careful of as journalists, to not sort of get swept away by the word sustainable.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, the one thing our industry has is really active and great PR and marketing. And sometimes part of the job is just winnowing what's a story that's important and interesting and what's just sort of PR.
And that's an interesting thing, because you have to kind of go beyond the aesthetic, right? Beyond the beautiful product, beyond the novelty of the product, perhaps how the rare it is, how, the techniques involved, and really go to the core of the people behind it. And that really takes some digging, asking tough questions, and have some conversations that perhaps the PR team don't really want to explore. They want you to focus on these bullet points. Are they being more open about those questions, or more resilient? They're open up a little bit more to expose themselves and to those situations, or are you still very defensive?
So I'm the business development lead for Hem, which is a Scandinavian furniture design brand based in Stockholm, Sweden. And the way that we talk about sustainability, and some of this is led by the company's own efforts, and then some of it is just having been an editor and wanting to make sure that the way we talk about these things is as well-rounded as it can be. I think we want to talk about sustainability as a way you live, not a thing you buy or a thing you recycle or upcycle. And so the conversation around sustainability is much more holistic with our clients for that reason. So we're thinking about things like, packing a shipping container full of furniture before it's sent from the EU to the US, because that is actually has a huge impact on the business's carbon footprint, for example. So yeah, I think, taking it out of what Fiona pointed to, the greenwashing language that we're all much more familiar with now in this era, and thinking about sustainability as a way of living rather than just a thing you do in addition to your life or as like an accessory to the rest of the outfit is, I think, really important. And certainly the way that I talk about it with clients and the way that I've always, as an editor, approached telling those stories.
In terms of sustainability claims, I think it's good that our editors actually make it our job to sort of fact check a claim. So not only is there a job to be done about contextualizing things, but there's also vetting or fact checking. And sometimes it just takes calling a third party to sort of like check a claim. In terms of companies being more open, I think that was your original question. Mm-hmm. It really depends. And you kind of have to read closely what they're revealing, because maybe that also tips to what they're not revealing. So it's a broad spectrum, but I feel like more companies want to come forward with some kind of information when it comes to sustainability. So that was your original question.
I think the issue there is also around the fact that sort of transparency isn't regulated in any way. So, there's no real guidelines really on a global scale, as far as I'm aware, that kind of forces companies and brands to reveal a set of credentials. So I think we need to work on the transparency component. And I also agree with you, Asad, that it's really about behavioral change too, which maybe people think then isn't really a design concern. But I think the way you design your life, is so you can twist it, I guess, in that sense, because it can't be about, okay, I'm gonna help solve climate crisis by shopping differently. It's like, no, it's not about what you buy. It's about what you don't buy.
Maybe shop less.
Yeah.
Shop less. Right.
And or repair, sorry, Paul.
In architecture, where some degree of sustainability has become expected to the point where I don't think anybody deserves any particular credit for doing it. I said to somebody not long ago, at this point, to say your building is designed with some attention to sustainability is like saying you want credit for putting inside plumbing and electricity into it. I mean, it's just... should be so basic that, don't expect brownie points for this. I mean, this is not, and increasingly we're realizing in the world of buildings, at least, sometimes the most sustainable option is not to build a building at all. It's to reuse the building you have. And, I get very upset when developers come and show you where they're going to put up this brand new, fantastic energy saving house, and they're only going to tear down this perfectly good existing house to build it. Well, at the end of the day, you've spent far more energy tearing down the old house, which could have probably been rehabilitated at a reasonable cost, and building the new one. The fact that the new house might use less energy than some imaginary, hog of a house, is not sufficient, and certainly doesn't belie the fact that the the most sustainable building is the old one you already have a lot of the time.
Do you feel that maybe our cities are losing a little bit of the cultural heritage because we're putting so many new buildings that they might all look alike, but has very little to resemblance to the heritage of the culture of that place that used to be there?
That's a huge question. The short answer is simply to say, yes, you're right. And, then to sort of, because you are right. It's a huge question to answer properly, because it has to do not just with design, but with the whole nature of global capital and investment today. And the fact that so much real estate is not developed locally anymore, but internationally through global investment capital that sort of sloshes around the world like the ocean waters. And but yes, it is. Places are becoming more the same. They're also, and it's deeply troubling. There's a certain amount of pushback against it, but not enough. There are times when actually one is glad for an economic setback, because it at least becomes a force that slows it down. I mean, not that long ago, before the current situation, my wife and I took somebody who is based in New York, is an international traveler who actually alternates between the EU and New York, to a dinner at a new restaurant in Hudson Yards. And afterwards he said, thank you so much. This has really been fun. And you've saved me all this time, because one of the few places in the world I've never been is Dubai. And now I don't have to go. I feel I've been there, he said. So you've just saved me a 14-hour flight with this dinner. And he was right. I mean, there is this oddly Dubai quality of Hudson Yards that I find off-putting. The subject of places becoming too much like other places is a vast subject that really has to do, I think, with the not only investment capital, but the forces toward a kind of global monoculture that are deeply troubling, even though they've also helped people come out of poverty, raise the level of employment and education and health in many places. So it's a vast and profoundly troubling and complicated issue that is definitely partly a design issue, but design is almost the byproduct here of other forces that design cannot control, I don't think.
I do have hope, though, that some of the monoculture you point to and the ways that it kind of creates like a sameness in our cities can be beat back by like people's design interventions, just like, people taking over parking spaces. And I know that those things are really small and have been, parklets and those like parking space interventions are not new news, but that's happening in a new way in this pandemic, because in New York, for example, a lot of restaurants are using those parking spaces as areas for outdoor seating. And there's something about that makes me think, the vines start to climb these glass towers, the vines of people's own interactions with their built environment and their cities, that can hopefully be a force against that. Certainly in a moment like now, when there's a recession, perhaps a depression, and people aren't going, developers aren't going to be working at the same speed as they have been.
Totally
like
right. Yep.
So I don't know. I agree. There's a huge problem, and also I have hope that people will begin to see how they can make their cities work for them in ways that they may not have thought of or considered before.
I agree completely with you, Asad. That's right. There are a lot of forces pushing in the other direction, and they're encouraging. And some of them are even big and reasonably powerful ones. I mean, we forget that for 50 years, New York has had the Landmarks Commission, which has now become kind of the de facto most powerful land use authority in the city, because the City Planning Commission doesn't do much except say okay to things like Hudson Yards. it's the Landmarks Commission, by designating historic districts, that's actually the greater force for pushing back against development and keeping scale controllable and so forth. So, but there's so many individual initiatives and things like that that are pushing against this. So it's a question of, do we want to look at the glass as half empty or half full, I guess. Mm-hmm. Forces on both sides.
What kind of stories do you want to tell? What interests you?
The most thrilling stories for me to tell, as maybe we've touched on, are kind of those like oddball stories that don't seem like a design concern on the surface, that actually flowers like the best kind of like design story when you dig into this, you know, the value chain of like whatever you're writing about. I think that's the most satisfying. Also really satisfying when you get to shine a light on unknown genius in like some sort of part of the world where we never really look for design. And maybe also sometimes also find like an unknown hero or genius piece of design from another culture that we have never heard of. I think those are the most thrilling stories for me.
What about you, Fiona?
It's a hard question to answer. I don't want to repeat myself, but you know, I'm not a, you know, I didn't go to journalism school wanting to talk about design necessarily, and I don't have a design background in the way that I'm guessing some people on this panel maybe do. So for me, you know, I get my kicks from talking about things that on the surface don't sound like design, but then ultimately are. I also really, as much as I love thinking about the future, and I love, you know, all the sort of bombastic innovation stories that you can tell that, you know, often get a lot of attention because they sort of offer that kind of awe-inspiring moment. You know, I really do enjoy looking back at history too, and looking at the sort of origins of things, and finding sort of quirks and, you know, weird and wonderful stories from the past, and kind of bringing them to surface, and maybe looking at them within the context of the here and now, you know, and kind of moving the conversation on in that sense by putting them into the context of today. So yeah, I mean, you're never going to get me super excited about a sort of straight product chat, you know, and I don't think to interview another Syrkett anytime soon, but you know, I think those design stories that just are about way more than design are the things that get me excited.
Yeah, for me, I think just stories about how design intersects with people's real lived experience. I mean, some of that, like some people's real lived experience is out on the street, joining a protest movement. Some people's real lived experience is engaging with design in pop culture. And I think that some of the ways that, as an editor who's worked at you know, magazines that focus on interiors, focus on architecture, we create hierarchies within our own coverage about design, about like what design is worth covering. But, you know, Fiona's saying that, you know, you don't have a traditional background in design, but you have such an eye and a way and a journalism background that allows you to investigate and interrogate some of, you know, the design subjects that you cover. And I think people who don't have, you know, capital D design experience are actually the people that I enjoy hearing from, because they live with buildings and with furniture and with streetscapes in the same way that someone like Paul does. And their value, you know, the value of their opinion is not less because they don't have formal training. They're just bringing something new to their assessments of the world around them. And so that, for me, is really interesting, how to get those voices amplified in a way that they can actually contribute and be heard. Because I think, you know, design is for all of us. And it's incredibly cheesy to even just say that, but like it is, you know, design is for all of us, certainly at a building scale, certainly at a city scale. So.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent my whole life trying to find ways in which architecture and design intersect with the rest of the world, because I think, you know, architecture is about everything and design is about everything, and it becomes more interesting when you can find moments or occasions in journalism to discuss those connections and points of intersection. And it is not about the cult of the object, even though I think all of us probably love beautiful objects as much as anybody, but we also know their limitations, and we know that they don't bring you to nirvana. That in fact, at the end of the day, it's about how it all connects to life and changes it, and hopefully makes it a little bit better. That's all. It's all it's ever really been about, I think, at least for me.
And if you look at the scale of the media covering design, architecture, in a global level, it's fair to say that perhaps, are we doing a good job?
It's hard to generalize, I think, because there's now so much out there. Mm-hmm. Design, like every form of journalism, is now a complex mix of old legacy publications that do not have the omnipotence that they once did, or at least that people thought they once did. It might have been an illusion. But there are so many other voices all over the place. And I think part of the challenge, in fact, is now, to go back to something Asad said a few minutes ago, we're all interested in hearing other voices and learning from them. And I feel I learn more from seeing how people interact with design than I often do from designers themselves. But at the same time, design, it's not simply a referendum. It's not just a popularity contest. The best design is not the one that the most people say wow to. And so how do you navigate between some degree of expertise and authority, and don't reject that totally, but at the same time open up to hearing from other influences, incorporating them in what you write, learn from them, and listen to them. And it's a balance between those things, and that's a huge. Maybe that's the single biggest challenge a design journalist faces today. Is you don't throw expertise out the window, and this is again not about education, because obviously Fiona, whether she has a design degree or not, knows a lot. So you're not going to reject all that knowledge, but at the same time, not impose it as some kind of judgment from above in a simplistic way, but incorporating all kinds of other influences and always learning and never thinking you yourself have all the answers.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up here, because after this one was a perfect end. I want to thank so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I want to challenge you guys, and also encourage you to continue to do what you're doing, pushing the limits, pushing the boundaries. We did a big research about the people that we want to talk to, and all you kind of come out top of the list, because I think everybody's doing different work, but also important work. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And I'll make sure to connect all you guys so everybody can stay in touch and then hopefully collaborate, do things together, because at the end of the day, this is what it's about, right? We all kind of put our hands together and do something great.